All right, so what significant event did we just study about in chapter 11, and how did that chapter end specifically in regard to Jesus and his whereabouts? Okay, and his what? Not just his death, his resurrection. And then under what circumstances did that take place? I guess in regard to the environment that Jesus was going into. Were there any objectors to that? So,
the Jews are still looking to kill him.
Yeah.
And he's going
Back to Judea. And his disciples tried to get him to not do that because they were looking to kill him. But he did it anyway. And he went for the express purpose of performing what would be his final miracle in John's record, and perhaps his greatest miracle, as we've seen through all 7 of these. Of course, that's not including his own resurrection from the dead. And so it would just elevate the tension with the Pharisees and the chief priests, the Jewish rulers. So then what did he do after that? Where did he go? He went down to Bethany, of course, and then went back where? At the end of that chapter. In verse 54 of chapter 11. Ephraim went to a city called Ephraim. So that was north. Randy had a map for us that was very helpful. And then now in chapter 12, he's coming back down to Bethany. And he's going to eat with them. This is not just going to be a silent situation, but it says, beginning in verse 9, that a lot of the Jews knew he was there, and they went out to see him. And then the next day begins the last week of Jesus' life, the Sunday before he would be crucified on that Friday. And then the following Sunday after that would be his resurrection. And so that's where we are in this context, right there at the end. We still have several chapters to go, but this is right in the thick of it. So let's go ahead and read the first 8 verses of this text about the anointing at Bethany. If someone doesn't mind reading verses 1 through 4, and then someone pick up and finish 5 through 8. I appreciate the dramatic pause. I know. I should have just said read verses 1 through 8. Thanks, DJ. That was my fault. I went mathematically and not with the narrative. That was a weird pause. And that's my fault. All right, so first question is, when did Mary anoint Jesus from verse 1? What does that say there? 6 days before the Passover, right? Remember, we've noted before 3 Passovers that John's Gospel mentions. First one beginning in chapter 2 with the Passover that he went to where he would cleanse the temple for the first time. And then there's another Passover right in the middle. And now we're at the final Passover, which gives us the understanding of 3 years of his ministry. And there are some things that the Synoptic Gospels record. If you're not familiar with that term, it means synonym. So they all cover the same events almost exactly, with some additions and subtractions. John's Gospel is very unique. It has a lot of things that aren't included in the others, so it stands out. So the Synoptic Gospels record some things that John does not hear. In fact, when we get to the triumphal entry, you'll notice that John is very succinct with his dealing with that event. But at any rate, he is he is near the end of his life before the final Passover, where in John 13 we'll see that the supper being ended, he washed the disciples' feet, and that's the same context as taking the Passover or observing the Passover and then instituting the Lord's Supper before he would, of course, fulfill all that it indicated. Let's see. So they're there 6 days before the Passover. It says in the Synoptic Gospels they're in the house of Simon the leper. And so they're not in Mary and Martha and Lazarus' home, but they are evidently a key part of this get-together, where it almost seems that they're honoring him. In verse 2 it says, they made him a supper. Doesn't just say they made supper and Jesus was there, but this seems to be especially something for Jesus. And I think it's very easy to understand why that might be the case. His whole ministry is coming to an end, and at this point, these people, at least the main characters of this particular setting and account with the disciples and then Mary, Martha, and her brother, are devoted believers in who Jesus is, even though their knowledge is limited. But on top of that, their brother was just raised from the dead, and that was not just a cold miracle. All of Jesus' miracles involve his compassion and his love for mankind, even the ones where a person is not necessarily made well or raised to life. He shows compassion in feeding. He shows compassion even in walking on the water to his disciples, because it provides them a stability and an assurance because of how solid he is and how in control he is. So they are thanking him, and they are giving him honor in this in the final days of his life. They made him supper. It says that Martha served. What does that remind you of? Does it remind you of anything, especially about her?
She complained about that.
Okay.
Serving while Mary was listening.
Yeah. So in Luke 10, it records a separate occasion that itself shows the close relation of Jesus with this family. And Martha is busy with serving and complains to the Lord about Mary not helping her. And he tells Martha what about Mary? She has what? Chosen the good part. And that's kind of similar here. I mean, we see that with people recorded in the Bible. Their character is established and it's developed. I thought as we studied in John 11, that came to my mind, and it seemed to me that Martha had grown. I mean, she's the one that made the confession in John 11 that he is the Christ, even though her brother had just died. She showed her faith in the rabbi, the master teacher, her Lord. And so that's certainly not a knock on her, but she's at it again serving, and that's a wonderful thing. But Mary seems to be a little more keenly aware of the circumstance that they're in and takes advantage of it. Lazarus is there, which is significant because of what we just read about him, and also people coming to see him in addition to Jesus. So what did Mary do that was so impressive? Took the oil that was very costly and anointed his feet, wiping his feet with her hair. That is different from the Synoptic Gospels, which leave a detail out and add a detail that this doesn't have. There, that says that she anointed his head with the oil. Here it says that she wiped his feet with her hair. And I think he noted in the book, I can't remember, I think I read it there, but of course, they're not sitting at a table like we would, but they're laying on a side with their elbow propping them up, reclining at the table. And that's going to be helpful as we think about the supper scene in John chapter 13 as well. But his feet are sticking out, and that's what she does. That's weird for us. It would have been weird for them as well. They're upset about wasting the oil, but on top of that, this is a kind of a unique scene. But what does it show about Mary? As you read that, as you're thinking about that, what does that show that a woman would do something like that, Kurt?
Well, we'd already kind of speculated in the last chapter that Mary and Martha and Lazarus had come from a family with some money.
Yeah.
And
Seems to
so
be.
while we think this is rather an odd occurrence, perhaps it's not so odd. It's not fantastic because they do have the money.
Mhm.
But the fact that she would anoint Jesus seems to be almost providential.
Sure. Yeah.
Like the only person upset about it was Judas Iscariot.
Well, and it seems with Jesus' words, it's not like he's implying that she knows everything, all the significance of what she's doing. I think that she's sincere in this, and she's wanting to do something that is significant for him because of her love for her and her gratitude for her. But it's very well used by God, providentially, it seems, to indicate something far greater. And what do the other Gospels say about her in this regard? Or Jesus, what does he say about her that John doesn't specifically record? Yeah, she's going to be right. Wherever the gospel is preached, she's going to be talked about, right? It'll be told as a memorial to her. So she finds great honor in doing this. And that really is a microcosm of what Jesus has been teaching his disciples this whole time, that greatness is through humble service. And that's exactly what Mary does. It's interesting that in Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 1, it tells us a good name is better than precious ointment. And that is demonstrated graphically in this true story about Mary using her fragrant ointment oil to anoint Jesus' feet and procuring for herself a good name. And of course, that's not what it was about for her, but that's what God promises us. If we humbly serve him, then we will be honored by him. And that's precisely what Jesus would say in verse 26. If anyone serves me, let him follow me. And where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, him my Father will honor. It also says she has done what she could. And I think that's significant. A lot of times we have visions of grandeur and we paralyze ourselves because of that instead of just doing what we can. That's what she did. Scott?
And it shows complete humility and humbleness, and we're to be that no matter what position you're in, what wealth you have, whatever it is, you're to be humble in the sight of the Lord. And she showed that.
That's a great point. And I think that's what comes to my mind with, her wiping his feet with her hair. She wasn't above doing that. And as weird as that may sound, and I think any significance to it specifically is speculation, because I think culturally this was out of the norm. I know that, the Bible talks about the woman's hair as her glory. 1 Peter 3 talks about, and 1 Timothy 2 talks about the ornamentation of a woman's hair, and make sure that's not what you're all about, but that you're ornamenting your soul and that you've got that spirit that is precious in the sight of God. So, and I think even in our culture, a woman's hair is very important to her, and that's what she decided to do with her hair. Use something like that in the capacity of being a servant, and that's impressive. It'd be impressive that she did this before Jesus did something similar in the next chapter. So this woman did what she could, and what she could was be humble and do something for the Lord, and that's what we've got to keep doing. Scott?
Which is 100% opposite of Judas.
Yes.
Which is stealing out of the bag, and he's seen all this. He's seen all these miracles. He's right there, and he has no humility.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, and that opens the door for that next section, that she doesn't say anything. She just does something and lets her actions speak. And, of course, Judas is a hypocrite, and a lot of times the way hypocrisy shows itself is in saying something or acting in a certain way that is sanctimonious, meaning a holier-than-thou mentality that's really just a show. And that's what he does. Couldn't we have sold this and given it to the poor? Well, that wasn't in his heart at all. And so in his avarice and covetousness, he actually has the audacity to act as though he humbly cares about the poor and he's compassionate about them. And I think that is is he's a poster child of corruption and hardness of heart. And so that's exactly what happens. He's noted in John as the one who betrayed Jesus. And of course, John is writing after all of this. And it's sad that that's what Judas always has attached to his name. He's the betrayer. He's the betrayer. And of course, that's something we got to take to heart as well. What we're doing now is something that is going to be significant in the future. And so we need to make sure it's a good thing in service of the Lord. So what did he say that oil could have been sold for? Yeah. How much, though? 300 denarii, which... About a year's salary, right? That's incredible. Incredible that there is perfume that costs that much. Incredible that knowing how much it costs, she used it in that way, right? And I think that's the significance of it. Her using it in that way shows her value of the Lord. And I think that we can learn from that as well. You can't put a money sign on it, obviously, but even when you have someone like the widow giving her 2 mites, that pales in comparison to this, it was a ton because it was all that she had. It was her livelihood, and that corresponds to her devotion as well. And then, of course, Judas is thinking, I'm going to pocket this. Paul, did you have something?
Yeah, it almost seems to me that Mary and Martha have a better understanding on what's fixing to happen than some of the disciples do.
Yeah.
I've never noticed that before until reading it this close.
Yeah, it might be the case. In fact, when he says in verse 7, let her alone, she has kept this for the day of my burial. Anyone else have a translation that reads a little differently than that? Leave her alone, she has kept this for the day of my burial. There is a manuscript difference that shows in the New American Standard Bible and the English Standard Version, I believe. And Jesus says, let her alone, that she may keep this for my burial. Which is the most accurate thing, I don't know. I think that some would claim there's more evidence for one than the other. In the New King James Version, it seems like that was her whole purpose for holding on to this oil. And then after she does that, perhaps that's what Jesus is saying that she can hold on to it for. I don't know how sure she was about that, but it's at the very least profound that, like Kurt was saying, this was used by God providentially to stand for what would be done in a burial, and that Mary is doing it beforehand. And you know, that's significant too, because usually the person's passed away and they're gone, and you do that in honor of them, but Mary's doing it while he's still here. And he's about to say in chapter 12, walk in the light while you have the light with you. She's taking advantage of her time because the Lord isn't always going to be there. Does she fully know that 100%? I don't know where her head is. But at the very least, she stands as an example of that. Larry?
I was going to say they all knew it was very dangerous for Jesus to be back in Jerusalem.
Yes, absolutely. And remember what Thomas says, let's go that we may die with him, right? And then Peter says, I'll die for you too. And so there's all of that, and then there's confusion about what the kingdom's going to be like and stuff. So all of that factors into this. But at the very least, her faith is being shown emphatically, and that's certainly why it's recorded for us, because it was significant, not speculative. It was significant what she did. She showed great faith, regardless of what she understood. Something interesting about the other Gospels, they record that it wasn't just Judas. It was the others or some others at least, that were upset about this. I don't know what that necessarily says. It seems to me John paints Judas as the ringleader, and that kind of shows how evil company can corrupt good habits. They don't know he's evil company, but because he's been around them and because he has this spirit, he's certainly affecting them. And their true heart's condition would show itself in the end, and his would too. But that's at least something worthy, I think, to be pointed out. He is hard-hearted, to say the least. In fact, where's the first time that he's mentioned, the last time he's mentioned in John's Gospel? You remember? Did you trace that down? When's the last time John mentions Judas Iscariot? He's in Galilee in chapter 6. And many left and followed him no more. And then Jesus says something that John then comments on. Jesus says, "Did I not choose you, the 12, and one of you is a devil?" And John tells us he spoke of Judas Iscariot, who would betray him. And really what Judas is joined to in this passage is the people who left and followed him no more. I'm not saying that's when that clicked or anything like that. It seems that it was a gradual progression of his character, or a digression of his character, as Satan took advantage of him and he didn't have the faith to have his guards up. But back in chapter 6, he's identified with unbelievers, and that would progress to this point. In fact, what happens after Judas complains about what Mary did? John doesn't record it. What does he do, though?
He goes to the rulers and betrays them.
Yeah, he goes to the rulers to conspire with them how to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. I didn't get the 300 denarii, so I'm going to get something. And it's going to even be at the expense of Jesus and his life. So that's who Judas is. And chapter 13 would mention some of that as well. Let's see. So Jesus says she's kept this for the day of my burial, but then says in verse 8, "The poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always." And what is the significance of that statement? That's our question number 5. What is the significance of Jesus' statement there? I imagine there are several answers you could give to this. Yeah. I mean, this book ends, the chapter, because he'll say that specifically at the end of his ministry. Walk while you have the light with you. Time is coming when you don't have that, and lest the darkness overtake you, walk with me now. Take advantage of the time you have with me. There's something more special than even the greatest and most severe physical need, and that's Jesus. That's always the case. And, this doesn't specifically have to do with something like institutionalism or whatever, deciding whether or not we're going to use the church's treasury to give to an orphanage or whatever it may be. But it does have a principle lying underneath that it's not doing good for the sake of doing good. It's doing good in service of Jesus. And I'm sure you've heard it been said that not only just within greater Christendom, and I use that term, of course, accommodatively, it's not something we would use, but those who call themselves Christians, even in the denominations, who are not actually Christians because they're not faithful to the Lord, you've heard that it was said that, basically it all boils down to the same thing, and that's be good to each other. Or even just in religion generally. Let's not argue about which one's right. They all pretty much say the same thing. Be good to each other. That boils it down to a sort of humanism. Jesus doesn't say that you shouldn't feed the poor. He doesn't say that you shouldn't have compassion on the poor. He doesn't say that's not a part of his character. What he does say is that I'm more important. And that's the main thing. Which would mean that if there's anything that comes between you and the Lord, including violating a pattern to do something that you think's good, it's not good. And that's really what discipleship is. It's not doing for the sake of doing, or as a set of principles you've adapted or accepted. It's loving the Lord. And so it will include a lot of these things, but under that umbrella. Steve?
I think, again, as so many times, he's taken also away from the physical. Don't
Yeah.
worry about the physical so much as be concerned with the spiritual.
Definitely.
I'm not going to be here much longer. Focus on the spiritual things in this life. Like you said, do good to the poor when we can do good. But, that in the long run isn't really going to be what matters.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of reflects his own words in chapter 9, where he talks about, as long as it is day, I must do my Father's work. The night is coming when no one can work. We only have a limited amount of time. And what Jesus wants us to do is serve him, which would include some of these things, but that's your priority. That's your focus, and it'll take care of the rest as well. Anything on that? Yeah.
Well, in Matthew 6, if that's what it was all about, he's, if you're doing anything to please men or to make yourself, a lot
Sure.
of people think the importance to make themselves feel good.
Yeah, themselves.
There's nothing in that, it's
Right.
doing it to the Lord. So if you are doing a good deed, that's why, because what they're doing in Matthew 6 is they're praying, they're doing
Right.
what the world would say is good things, but they don't have the right intentions, so therefore, it's not, so we've got
Yeah.
to, it's all about pure.
Absolutely, and that applies too with what Jesus says after that, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. If your treasure is honor from men, hey, that's where your heart is. It should be with focus on the Lord. Great points. All right, so a great many of the Jews, verse 9, knew he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. This really shows their corruption and their dishonesty. Are they disputing the miracle? Are they sending a lawyer out there, as we would think of lawyer, saying, wait a second, there's this minor discrepancy and this can't be true? They're not doing that at all. They respect eyewitness testimony, at least intellectually. They know they can't go up against this. There's a reason why multitudes are going out to see him, because there are many eyewitnesses with corroborating stories. So instead of trying to dispute the facts, they're going to kill the facts. They're literally going to destroy living evidence. And that is, just obvious corruption. So they conspire not just to kill Jesus, but to kill Lazarus. Now, the chief priests were primarily composed of Sadducees, which would be significant. Why in this case? What about Sadducees might fit this context? Yeah, they didn't believe in the resurrection, but this guy was raised. So there goes our doctrine. We got to make sure that instead of changing to fit the truth, we change the facts, which of course they couldn't do. All right, someone read verses 12 through 15.
The next day, a great multitude that had come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him and cried out, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. Then Jesus, when he had found a young donkey, sat on it, as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt.
All right, thank you. No, let's pause there, 15. Thank you, brother. All right, so this is the next day. That would be Sunday. There's some dispute about that in regard to the things John says about the days, but I think it's pretty well understood. It's Sunday, which is why you have Palm Sunday, which is not something we observe, but that's where that comes from. And so Jesus is coming to Jerusalem, and they take palm branches, of course, and then Scripture is quoted by the people, and then Scripture is quoted by the writer John. So, number 7 is, what is the significance of Jesus' triumphant entry? Triumphant entry. That's a loaded question.
That's how King of Peace in Jerusalem would enter Jerusalem. With the palm trees and the donkey.
King of Peace coming to Jerusalem. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else to add to that, Larry?
It was fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.
Yeah, definitely. So, verse 16 really hits at that too, because they weren't even thinking about that at the time. But John's reflecting on this and saying, then they remembered these things happened and what significance that they had, right? This is fulfillment of prophecy, one of many that shows he is who he says he is. Anything else? Are they insincere in this, or pretty well welcoming him, it seems like, with sincerity? They're excited? Yes?
I think they're sincere in what they think he's there to do.
Yeah, what they think, right?
They think he's there to be a political and military leader that's
Sure.
free them from Roman rule.
Yeah, I think that's the misunderstanding. I preached a lesson a long time ago. I've not been preaching a long time, so for me a long time ago it seems, called from the triumphal entry to the cross. How we just talked about the time period. This is Sunday. He's crucified on Thursday. A lot of these people there who are saying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, are saying, crucify him, crucify him. How did that happen? I think that that we have the key in what they thought, right? And so they think of it politically. Remember back in John 6, what were the Galileans trying to do for him or to him? Take him by force and make him king. Now, what kind of king? Well, the context establishes a physical king because Jesus basically rebukes them for that. And when he talks about the spiritual, they go back and follow him no more. So he's coming in after a resurrection. Now they're like, okay, enough questions. We've got the answers. But they are mistaken about what he came to do. Yes?
Even those closest to him had the same misconception.
Yes.
For a few hours, Peter went from swinging a sword to denying.
Exactly. And so they're not above this either, right? And it really shows just how alone Jesus was, how much of a sacrifice this was on top of just what we know about it. This would even lead to his disciples not following him.
They hold on to this thought of him being an earthly king even to his resurrection.
Yeah.
Because when he's about to ascend back to the Father, they say, now are you going to restore the kingdom back to Israel?
Right.
And they still didn't get it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to read a lot about that in the next several chapters with the work of the Holy Spirit and how he would reveal things they did not yet understand or know and could not know now, and it's not time. And a lot of that would happen, day of Pentecost. Now we understand as God is showing this to us. So that's significant. These people are thinking that he is the Messiah. He is the Son of David. And he came for salvation, but physically. I think that's what they're thinking. They took palm branches, which is significant because of its imagery in Scripture. Psalm 91:12, the righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. Isaiah uses it to talk about the Lord, bringing down the exalted with those who are palm branches representing those who are higher in power and such. But during the Maccabean period, in between the Testaments, there was a couple of significant points in history that were celebrated, points of victory and liberation, with palm branches being associated with it, to the extent that in Jewish currency, the palm leaf was stamped on their currency. And I read even the Romans in destroying the Jewish nation would then put it on their currency as kind of a slight to them. And so it stands for joy and victory, deliverance, freedom, all of that kind of stuff. And that's what's going on here. They're thinking of a political deliverer in the Messiah. And so what they do is they say Hosanna, which is a form of praise. It means give salvation now. And of course, that's with anticipation of it. And this is the man who has the power to do it. And they quote from Psalm 118, verses 25 and 26. It's a psalm of thanksgiving and praise to the Lord for deliverance through victory. Also in that psalm is a messianic prophecy about what? Anybody read through that? The chief cornerstone. And this is the day the Lord has made. We'll rejoice and be glad in it. So the stone that the builders have rejected have become the chief cornerstone. And that's kind of ironic because here they're thinking he is the guy, and then they're going to reject him. And they're going to fulfill that prophecy as well. And it's because, like Jeff said, they don't understand, nor does anyone really understand what the purpose of the Messiah is. And so they'd reject him, and then he'd give them opportunity to accept him after the fact when he's raised from the dead and is sent through the Holy Spirit to preach the truth. They even call him the King of Israel. Now, what significance does this section on him riding a donkey and fulfilling Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9, what significance does that have?
Not a king of war.
Yeah. In fact, in the very context of Zechariah 9 and verse 10, it talks about taking away the chariot and the instruments of war, and then the dominion from sea to sea. So his dominion is one that is spiritual, not through carnal warfare, and it's one that promotes peace, not beating people over the head. It's one that invites men by God's grace to peace. And in that, he is prophesied to sit on a donkey's colt, which would be very not unique in Israelite history, as that was something that happened, but in the whole concept of what they're anticipating, especially in world history, what would a king ride in on? A war horse, right? So this certainly shows humility. And then the very context of Zechariah 9 shows peace. So completely different than what they would expect, and it's right in their face. But of course they don't see it, and I don't know that we would either. I'm sure we wouldn't. Verse 16, the disciples didn't understand these things at first, and Jesus was glorified. They remembered that these things were written about him and that they had done these things to him. And that is significant as well. This is not orchestrated in their minds. It's happening to them in real time, and they're learning like we learn after the fact as well. So the chief priests see all of this, the Pharisees, in verse 19, what do they say? And who are they saying it to?
To each other.
They're saying it to each other. That's real interesting to me, at least. What are they talking to each other about? Verse 19.
The whole world is turning upside down, or turning to Christ.
Yeah, the whole world is going after him. And their world is getting turned upside down. I think that's what has them stressed. What's interesting is they're divided, aren't they? This has not been unanimous, and we even see that at least under the surface at the end of chapter 12, because a lot of them believed, but they did not confess him because they feared the Pharisees. And so it seems here that there was a division within the Pharisees. One group was more passive. Reminds me of Gamaliel in Acts 5. If this is of God, you can't overthrow it. If it's not of God, then it's not going to happen. They're kind of passive about this. And the other one is like, we got to kill him and Lazarus. We got to take them both down. And that more extreme group is finding a hold. And they're saying, look at what's happening. Look, your way's not working. We got to ramp this up a bit. And so you can kind of just see how Satan is working and how things are escalating in all of this, because one, God is at work and he's not going to be stopped, which means his opposition is going to ramp up their efforts as well. And ultimately it's just going to achieve God's will, but through their obstinance and their willful sin, of course, God's going to use them in that. Yes?
In chapter 11, the Pharisees send out a notice. If you see him, report him to us.
Yeah.
We want to arrest him, basically.
Yeah, great.
And then here he comes in, this great multitude. There he is, go arrest him.
Yeah, absolutely. They've got spies. They've got their little monkeys flying around. We've watched Wicked a few times recently, so they are working and they're going to get it done. And the comforting thing about that is, though, this is the plan that we read with joy, because God takes bad things and makes them into wonderful things, and that keys us into this next section. There were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast, and we're only going to get through to verse 26 tonight, maybe not even there. Greeks came up and they asked Philip from Bethsaida that they wished to see Jesus, so Philip came and told Andrew, and Andrew told Philip, or Philip came and told Andrew, and Philip told Jesus. So Greeks want to see him, and they're probably like Cornelius, devout Greeks who fear the God of the Jews, but they're not full proselytes, and so they're limited in the things that they can do, even though they have the respect of a lot of the Jews. They want to see Jesus. Why? I don't know. There's speculation as to why. Pretty interesting stuff as well, but I think the focus of John is that they're Greeks. And it seems, at first glance, that Jesus ignores them, but he actually doesn't. He's just working in his time. So this is what he brings up. First, he brings up and he's answering it because he's drawing all people to him. That includes the Greeks, and he'll say it specifically in verse 32. But he's going to talk about the necessity of death for life, how he's working within his Father's will. This is him demonstrating fellowship. And then he's going to exhort the people to follow him, to believe in him, because he is the way to that life. So first he talks about the necessity of death to have life. The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. That's different than what he's been saying. It's not my hour yet. It's not my hour yet. Now it is. And of course, we've noted several times that this glorification is not without his death. And so even in this term lifted up, which he'll say in verse 32, which signifies what? Crucifixion, the death he would die. Nail him to a cross, lift it up, and drop it into the ground. We saw that in John chapter 3 with the serpent and that being compared to his crucifixion as well. And so he's lifted up. That word actually means exalted. And of course, it can refer to it spatially in the sense of from one place to another place, but even figuratively in his exaltation. And so it kind of goes hands in hand. He's talking about his death. It's time for me to die. And then glorification through death because of conquering it and ascending. But then he says this, most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. So that's agriculturally true, scientifically true. But now he's using it spiritually. Why not go talk to the Greeks right now? Because, listen, I still got you in mind. I've got to do this for that to even mean anything to you. In fact, for it to mean anything to anybody. If he's going to bring many people to life, he first has to die. We'll pick up with the rest of it on Sunday, but he takes that and discipleship is not just learning from the master, but imitating him. And he takes that reality and he applies it even to his disciples. You have to die to live as well. You've got to lose your life to save it. And so he's not just calling us to do the difficult. He's doing it first and then calling us to follow him. So we'll pick up there, Lord willing.